Greetings, my name is Rick Gardner, and this is my teaching assignment for Religion 330, Principle and Practice of Teaching the Bible. The title of this is called Lead with a Servant's Heart. Before we get started, though, I want you to kind of get your mind in gear here for a second. Think of a leader who you feel is a highly effective leader. Okay, you got that? So I'm thinking of one. Okay, name 3 characteristics of that leader. Think of those. Can you think of them? A few examples might be character, commitment, communication, initiative might be one, self-discipline, maybe responsibility, vision. Have you considered serving others or servanthood? Because servanthood is not about a position or a skill, whether in a family or a job. It's about attitude. It's about what you think and how you feel. John Maxwell put it pretty straight. The author says, you've got to love your people more than you love your position. And I kind of chose to do this in a little bit different fashion as far as looking at it from a leadership perspective than simply a service perspective. My Bible passage that I chose is Mark 10:42 through 45. But before I get to that, I want to kind of just give you a little bit of background. Jesus had been mentoring the disciples for almost 3 years now for leadership roles that we will soon learn, and he will commission them later. But they were on their way to Jerusalem in what would be the final week of Jesus' life before the crucifixion, the Passion Week. James and John had just asked Jesus. They wanted to sit at his right and his left hand when he came into his glory, when he restored the kingdom. They were looking for positions of prestige and power. So Jesus realized that, these guys just aren't getting it right. They haven't learned yet. They're still being a little prideful. So now we come to the passage, and it starts off with verse 42, when Jesus called them together and said, those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom to many. So, as you can see, the way it is kind of set up is he sets up the incorrect world example, the Gentile leaders, and then he has a contrasting teaching of what he wants them to do, and then he gives them his example of how he lived his life. So my whole theme here is Christ requires that we lead with a servant's heart. We lead with a servant's heart because that's how Christ wants us to do it. In verse 42, where he calls them together, this kind of relates back to this leading with a servant heart, is because he's showing that the Gentile leaders and officials are very oppressive, and that's typical of the day. Key phrases there are lorded over them and authority over them. Think of the Roman Empire, how they conquered all of their subjects and they were controlling them. So the greatness here is shown in the worldly example, is shown by how many one can control. Okay, then we go on to verse 43. Not so with you. Here's the contrast. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. So this is where he's contrasting the style of the Gentiles to how he wants the disciples to lead. The key phrases there obviously are not so with you, because that sets up the contrast to the verse 42. And here he says, must be your servant. So what he's trying to say is greatness is not shown by who you can control, but greatness is shown rather by how many you can help. He goes on in verse 44 to kind of tighten it up a little bit, and he says, whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. So what he's trying to say here is that if you want to be first or lead, you must first be willing to surrender to all of those you lead. The key phrase there is slave of all. And here's where he really sets it up. He tells them how he wants them to do it. And then, as so many times in his teaching, he comes back and his life is the example. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom to many. He gives his own life as an example. Obviously, the key phrase is there to serve and to give his life. So how would this kind of look like? That's how it was back in Jesus' time. What do you think? How does it look like in our world? Does this relate? Can you think of any contemporary leaders in history today, say in the past maybe 30, 40 years, that would be like the Gentile rulers and high authorities? One pops into my mind right now. He's been in the news a lot lately. The leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He's leading a very oppressive government, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see why he is an oppressive leader. Also, Fidel Castro, the late Cuban dictator, is another example. But what about those that are servant leaders, or those who are service related, as in verses 42 or 43 and 44? One comes to mind. Mother Teresa is an example. She dedicated her life to serving others. Martin Luther King Jr., the Baptist minister who really didn't want to be the leader of the civil rights movement, but took up that calling because he was trying to help his people. Another one's Albert Schweitzer, famous musician and philosopher and theologian and missionary. He won the 1952 Nobel Peace Prize. He had I found a quote that I really like from him, and it says, "I do not know what your destiny will be, but one thing I do know. The ones among you who will be really happy are those who have sought and found how to serve." Okay, so that now we know how it kind of may look like in ours, but now let's bridge the gap a little bit. Let's bring it in and say, okay, you're probably asking yourself, are you a leader? What's a leader? Okay, every person is a leader of something. I don't care who you are. Every adult or even young adult is a leader. Some examples of leadership positions, some are very obvious. You got the president of a company, you got the president of a nation, the prime minister of a nation, a CEO, a commander of a brigade, a team captain of the baseball team. They're all leaders. Some that aren't really quite so obvious: husband, head of the household; wife, runs the family; father, maybe a mentor or a teacher to his sons and daughters; and mother, the same concept. We can see in Ephesians chapter 4, where Christ gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Those are all in a leadership type roles. In the Great Commission, in Matthew 28:18 through 20, Jesus gave us all a command: make disciples, baptize, and teach them to obey. Those are all leadership positions. All of us are called to make disciples, baptize, and to teach. So that makes us all leaders. And to take it a little bit further, Paul explains to the Corinthians in his second letter in chapter 5 that we all have a ministry of reconciliation. In verse 18, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So we're all leaders, my friend, all of us. And who is a leader? What does a leader do? It's light in a dark world. In Corinthians chapter 4, for what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves for your servants, Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of knowledge for God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. Jesus also gave one of his last lessons that he taught his disciples. He obviously thought that service and being a servant leader was very important. In one of his last lessons that he taught on the eve of his crucifixion in the upper room where he washed their feet after dinner. And I just want to read you, and that's in chapter 13 of John, verses 12 through 17. But I want to read you a couple here. It says, in verse 14, it says, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. For very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him." So he's kind of showing them the example. You have to do this. But like I mentioned earlier, servanthood, leadership, it's all an attitude. So Paul tells us what that attitude is in his letter to the Philippians. "Then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others in your relationships with one another. Have the same mindset as Christ Jesus." So that's kind of what the servant's heart looked like. So what does that mean to me? What does that mean to you? What do I want you to take out of this? As you go out there, you're going to be a leader. So you're going to be going out in a dark world. You're going to be the only light. You may be the only glimpse of that that many will get. So as you interact with people, do so with a servant's heart, in that attitude of Christ that we just mentioned. Do so that you can lead them to the light and share the gospel. For those of you who have families, as a leader of your family, interact with your family members in such a way that you put their needs before yours, and showing them what a servant's heart looks like. And as you conduct yourself in the work of your ministry, whether it is teaching children's Sunday school class or leading a small group or conducting a Bible study, also remember that we have that ministry of reconciliation. So we're to bring everybody back to Christ. But always put the needs of those you are serving before your own. Treat them with compassion. If you want to lead on the highest level, you have to be willing to serve on the lowest. So in everything you do, lead with a servant's heart. Thank you. Before we go, though, there's a couple of, something to think about here. Going through this passage, what does this passage tell you about the character of God? What does this passage tell you about the character of man, us? What is he teaching you? But most importantly, how can you put this principle into practice in your life today? Do you have a servant's heart?